Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about parasites and zoonoses. Anytime you talk about two individuals interacting with each other, you can classify that in various ways. One of the ways that you can classify interactions is based on who benefits. So in some cases, both individuals that are interacting have a benefit, either in terms of their reproductive fitness or their survival. In this situation, we call that mutualism or cooperation. Plus, plus, both individuals benefit. There's also, at least in theory, a situation where neither of the individuals benefit, they both pay a cost, and that's called spite, minus, minus. Then there are a number of different kinds of situations in which one member of the pair benefits and the other pays some sort of cost. If that's a lethal cost, we tend to call that predation. So you have the cheetah and the gazelle, and the cheetah runs down the gazelle and kills it and eats it. That's an example of predation. The cheetah obviously benefits because it gets a meal, and the gazelle obviously pays a cost with its life. But there are other cases that aren't quite so dramatic, and we call these parasitism. So this is a situation where one individual benefits, the other pays some sort of a cost, but it's generally not a lethal cost. It's just a matter of a slight decrease in its health, maybe a slightly higher probability of it dying early or not reproducing as much. We can also look at parasitism more closely by classifying it in a number of different ways. So one way is basically by size. We have microparasites, which are generally things that are too small to see, and macroparasites, which are easy to see with the naked eye. So just to show you a few examples of these, microparasites would consist of viruses. This is the HIV virus. And bacteria. This is the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. And fungi would also fall into this category of microparasites. Under macroparasites, there are a number of different kinds of things, invertebrates in this case. So this is something called a tapeworm. We'll take a look at its life cycle in just a minute. Other kinds of worms like nematode worms. These are roundworms that are typically found associated with the organs, internal organs of the body. Then we also have arthropods. This is the deer tick that is a carrier of Lyme disease. Another way of classifying parasites is as obligate or facultative parasites. Obligate means that the parasite is obligated to parasitize another individual. So that means it can't complete its life cycle, it can't reproduce, it can't survive unless it takes something from the organism that it's parasitizing. And usually that means feeding off of some of its body parts or its blood, or taking some of its meals from the food that the parasitized organism would be eating. Facultative parasites, on the other hand, can be parasitic, but they can also live independently depending on the situation. So they're not absolutely required to be parasitic for part of their life cycle. They can live completely separately and reproduce just fine. But if they have the opportunity to parasitize another individual, they'll do it. Then another way of classifying parasites is as endoparasites or ectoparasites. Endo meaning internal, ecto meaning external. So things like tapeworms and roundworms would be endoparasites, and things like ticks and fleas would be ectoparasites. So let's look at some of the characteristics of parasites. Usually they're smaller than the host species, so that comes in handy if you're trying to gain resources from another individual. You're less likely to kill it if you're much smaller and you're only taking a little bit away from it. Usually they're physiologically dependent on the host in some way, so they're getting something very valuable like food. They have often a great degree of specificity for particular species as hosts. So that means that they can live on or in those species. They're pretty much restricted, so they don't live on everything under the sun. They have particular species that they are highly likely to be associated with. And when they're parasitizing those particular species, they have the highest reproductive success. Sometimes they're able to parasitize other species, but with less success. So they have lower survival rates or lower rates of reproduction when they're associated with these other species. And when they're associated with their main host species, they have greater reproductive success. Usually they don't kill the host, but they may debilitate it. So they may cause that host species to be sickly and less likely to survive and less likely to reproduce. One of the most interesting things about parasites is their life cycles. Sometimes they have very, very complex life cycles that consist of living independently for part of their life cycle and being dependent for part of their life cycle, or they may be dependent on multiple species in sequence at different points in their life cycle. So I'm going to show just a couple of examples so that you have a little bit of an idea of what this means. So the life cycle of the deer tick, we'll be looking at this in much more detail in a minute, but I just want you to see how much diversity there is in host species. So if we start from where the eggs first hatch, the first thing they do is they get a blood meal from some warm-blooded animal, and they can choose a variety of different species of birds or small mammals. And then after that, when they get their blood meal, they detach themselves from the host and they undergo a molt, and so they change in body shape and size. And after they've molted, they get another blood meal, and again they attach themselves to some sort of warm-blooded mammal. This time they sometimes choose a larger bodied species like a deer, but they also could choose a small mammal or bird species. After they get this blood meal, they detach again and they molt into an adult. And later on, if they're female, they get a third blood meal in preparation for laying eggs, and the third host is most often a deer, sometimes a person, sometimes some other small mammal. So they go through several bouts of being parasitic and then being detached from the host species. The tapeworm is another example. So here's an example of a possible life cycle for a tapeworm. It lives in the intestines. I like this picture because it shows the girl eating the hamburger. Probably an undercooked hamburger, still has living tapeworms in it, and she's ingesting some of those cysts that are in the cow meat that she's eating here. Those cysts can colonize her intestinal tract and grow to form a fully grown tapeworm, which consists of these multiple repeating segments. And each one of these little segments contains these little eggs inside it. They break off in the intestinal tract and they go out with the feces. So when a wild animal might eat these cysts and grow the tapeworm in its abdominal tract or its digestive tract, when it passes feces, those feces would fall to the ground and would be kind of mixed in among the grass here. And when the cow comes along and eats the grass, it accidentally ingests some of these little egg things. And they, once they hatch and start to develop, they migrate and form cysts in the muscle tissue of the cow. So this is sort of a repeating cycle where the tapeworm has different parts of its life cycle in different organisms and looks kind of different in each of those settings. One of the cool things about tapeworms is they do inhabit the intestinal tract. If you think about what's happening in the digestive tract, there's food passing through all the time. So it's basically a pipe that things are moving through. But the tapeworm stays in there for long periods of time. It's only these final body segments that are breaking off and traveling out with the feces. It actually has very specialized mouth parts so that it hooks itself into the lining of the intestinal tract so that as everything else passes by, it can stay there. And then it has some sucking mouth parts at the top that allow it to parasitize the food that's coming through the host's digestive tract. So here's another picture of real live tapeworm. So here's the tapeworm's body. This is the end where the pieces start to break off. It's a little blurry, so you can't see the segments super well. This is the end with the head on it, and then this is a electron micrograph of what the head end looks like, and it's got all these little hooks, so that's what embeds into the lining of the intestinal tract, and then these are the suckers that pull in the food. Let's push that back down. All right, and the third one I wanted to show you is something called a meningeal worm. It's not a parasite of humans, but it is a parasite of a lot of hoofstock species. It evolved in places with white-tailed deer, so that's its normal primary host, and it doesn't make white-tailed deer very sick at all. It lives with in symbiosis with them, but if an exotic hoofstock species catches it, so a hoofstock species that is being kept and bred in a wildlife center or in a zoo, it causes debilitating illness, and I'll show you why. So this meningeal worm spends part of its life cycle in snails and slugs that are crawling around in the grass, and then it gets ingested accidentally by the deer. Once it goes into the deer's digestive tract, it finds a nerve ending and follows that nerve ending to the spinal cord, and then works its way up the spinal cord to the brain, and it lives in the meninges, the membranes that cover the brain. And once it reaches adulthood and reproduces, it'll lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch and work their way into the circulatory system, or into the lungs, and then they get coughed up from the lungs and swallowed down into the digestive tract, and then they pass out with the feces. So this worm in white-tailed deer lives in and around the spinal cord and central nervous system, but the reason that it's so debilitating and fatal to to things other than white-tailed deer is because as it travels up the spinal cord in other species, it actually eats its way through the nervous tissue, and so it causes paralysis. So its complex life cycle involves spending part of its life in a deer or other herbivore, and part of its life in snails and slugs. So we've talked about parasites in a very general sense, and some of those parasites could be classified as zoonotic diseases. So those are diseases that are carried by non-human animals but transmissible to humans. And we're going to take a closer look at one of these examples that's of great interest, great medical interest to humans.